On the surface, Millfield, Ohio, in the early autumn of 1987, looked like every other small American town you've ever driven through and immediately forgotten. A water tower with a faded football mascot, a diner called Patty's Place, where the coffee was always too hot and always too weak, a Methodist church that doubled as a community center on bingo nights, and the kind of deep Midwestern silence that sits between cornfields like something alive, something watching. The kind of town where everybody knew your name, your daddy's name, your grandmother's maiden name, and what you had for dinner on Sunday. The kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where kids rode bikes past dark without their parents worrying, where crime was something that happened in Columbus or Cleveland or on the nightly news. Not here, not in Millfield, not to anyone they knew. And yet, on the night of September 14th, 1987, something unspeakable crept into that quiet town and took something that could never be given back. And what followed would be one of the most haunting, frustrating, and ultimately jaw-dropping cold cases in the history of Athens County, a case that would sit in a cardboard box in a detective's storage unit for over 2 decades before a single phone call made from a gas station payphone in rural Kentucky cracked it wide open in a way nobody ever expected. My name is your host, and tonight on Cold Case Files, we are going deep into the story of Jane Marie Holloway, who she was, how she vanished, what investigators believed for 23 years, and what the truth turned out to be. Stay with me, because this one goes places you will not see coming. Chapter 1. Who was Jane Marie Holloway? Jane Marie Holloway was born on March 3, 1961, in Nelsonville, Ohio, the second of 4 children born to Robert or Bobby Holloway, a coal miner turned auto mechanic, and Dorothy Holloway, née Garfield, a school cafeteria worker who was universally described by everyone who knew her as the warmest woman in any room she ever entered. Jane grew up modest. They weren't poor exactly, but they weren't comfortable either, the way so many working families in Appalachian Ohio existed in that blurry in-between space where dignity was held together by hard work and community and the quiet understanding that you didn't complain because everyone else was in the same boat. She had brown hair she kept long through high school, hazel eyes that her mother always said changed color with her mood, and a laugh that people remembered decades later, loud and unashamed and a little contagious, the kind of laugh that made strangers look up from their meals in restaurants and smile without knowing why. Her younger sister, Carol, who is now 60 years old and lives in Parksburg, Virginia, described Jane to investigators in 2010 as someone who was simultaneously the most stubborn and the most generous person she had ever known. She would give you the shirt off her back, Carol said, but don't you dare try to tell her she was wrong about something unless you were prepared to be there for a while. Jane graduated from Athens High School in 1979, somewhere in the middle of her class, not an academic standout, but well-liked, involved in choir and the drama club, known for playing the lead in the junior year production of Grease, which the Nelsonville Gazette reviewed with the headline, "Local Girl Shines in School Musical." After graduation, she worked a series of jobs, a cashier at a grocery store, a waitress at a truck stop diner on Route 33, a part-time clerk at a hardware store, the kind of patchwork employment that defines young adulthood in small American towns, where opportunity is something you have to manufacture or leave to find. In 1983, she met a man named Dennis Ray Aldridge at a 4th of July party held at the Elks Lodge in Athens. Dennis was 31 years old, 7 years her senior, broad-shouldered and tan from working construction, with a quiet confidence that people sometimes mistook for intelligence and other times mistook for arrogance, depending on the day and the mood and the company. They dated for about 8 months, during which time Jane's friends noticed she seemed happy, but also noticed that Dennis had a temper. Nothing dramatic, nothing that anyone could point to and say, that right there is the red flag, just a low-grade irritability that surfaced in traffic and in restaurants and in conversations where he didn't get his way, the kind of temper that in 1984 most people would have called him being a man about it and moved on. Jane and Dennis married on April 14, 1984, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church in Millfield, where they had moved so Dennis could be closer to a construction job site that turned out to be more permanent than either of them had anticipated. They rented a white clapboard house on Elmwood Road, 3 bedrooms, a front porch with a swing that Jane painted yellow, a backyard with a creek running along the property line that flooded every spring, and that Dennis was perpetually swearing he was going to do something about. By 1986, they had a daughter, Emily, born October 2nd, a round-faced baby with her mother's hazel eyes and her father's stubbornness, or so the family said. By the summer of 1987, Jane and Dennis were not doing well. That much everyone agreed on, even Dennis himself, even years later when his cooperation became both grudging and legally complicated. They argued about money, about Dennis's drinking, about the fact that Jane had started taking evening classes at Ohio University in Athens, with vague plans to get a business degree, plans that Dennis reportedly did not support, plans that had generated more than one loud fight that the neighbors on Elmwood Road couldn't help but overhear through thin walls and open summer windows. Jane had also, according to at least 2 of her closest friends, been considering leaving Dennis. She hadn't said it out loud to him, hadn't filed anything, hadn't moved out, but she had said it to her friend Patrice Wheeler at a lunch in late August 1987, sitting in a booth at Patty's Diner, that she wasn't sure she could do this anymore, that she was tired, that she didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew something had to change. Patrice would repeat those words to investigators so many times over the years that she said she heard them in her sleep. Chapter 2. The night of September 14, 1987. On the evening of September 14, 1987, a Sunday, Jane Holloway Aldridge kissed her 14-month-old daughter on the forehead, handed her to her sister Carol, who had driven up from Nelsonville to babysit, told Carol she'd be back by 10 o'clock at the latest, and walked out the front door of the house on Elmwood Road. She was wearing a blue and white striped cotton shirt, dark wash blue jeans, and white Ked sneakers. She had her purse, a brown leather shoulder bag, and her car keys, the keys to her 1981 Toyota Corolla, tan with a busted right taillight that Dennis had been meaning to fix for 3 months. She told Carol she was going to meet a friend for dinner in Athens. She did not say which friend. She did not say where in Athens. She kissed Carol on the cheek, waved at baby Emily, who was banging a plastic cup against the coffee table, and she walked to her car and she drove away. And nobody who loved her ever saw her alive again. When 10 o'clock came and went and Jane hadn't returned, Carol wasn't immediately alarmed. Jane could be a talker when she got going.
Maybe dinner had run long. Maybe she was catching up with someone she hadn't seen in a while. By 11, Carol was mildly concerned. By midnight, she was worried. At 12:30, she called Dennis, who was reportedly at a bar in town called the Rusty Nail with a group of co-workers, a fact that would be confirmed by multiple witnesses and would become a point Dennis made repeatedly and emphatically in the years to come. Dennis came home, and by 1 in the morning, he had called the Athens County Sheriff's Department to report his wife missing. The deputy who took the call, a young man named Gary Treader who had been on the job for about 8 months, later described Dennis as upset but controlled, precise with details, which Treader found somewhat unusual but attributed at the time to shock. Dennis told Deputy Treader that Jane had gone to have dinner with a friend in Athens, but that he didn't know which friend or where, and that her car, the tan Toyota, was nowhere in the neighborhood, which suggested she had indeed left as Carol said, but had not returned. A missing persons report was filed, and within 24 hours it had been picked up by investigators at the Sheriff's Department, primarily because Jane Holloway Aldrich left behind a 14-month-old daughter and had no history of simply disappearing, no history of drug use, no financial problems severe enough to prompt flight, no indicated desire to just walk away from her life. 3 days later, on September 17th, a deer hunter named Gerald Fusco was walking a creek bed about 4 miles outside of Millfield on a logging road off County Road 25 when he found Jane's tan Toyota Corolla parked at the end of a dirt spur, half hidden by overgrown brush, driver's door unlocked, keys in the ignition. Her purse was in the car, her wallet was in the purse, her driver's license, her $14 in cash, her Ohio University student ID, all of it untouched. Whatever had happened to Jane Holloway Aldridge, robbery was not part of it. Gerald Fusco ran back to his truck and drove to the nearest house with a phone and called the sheriff's department, and within 2 hours the area was cordoned off and investigators were processing the scene with the grim focus of people who already suspected they were not going to find a happy ending to this story. They were right. Jane's body was discovered on September 19, 1987, approximately 600 feet from where her car had been parked, in a shallow depression between two fallen oak trees in a dense section of Millfield State Forest. She had been strangled. The medical examiner, Dr. Constance Varga, determined the cause of death as asphyxiation due to manual strangulation, estimated the time of death at some time during the late evening of September 14th or in the very early hours of September 15th, consistent with Jane having left her house and driven directly to that location. There were no defensive wounds on her hands. There was evidence she had been moved after death. The position of her body relative to the lividity pattern suggested she had been killed elsewhere and placed there. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Her clothing was intact. Whoever had taken Jane Marie Holloway's life had brought her to those woods, left her between two fallen trees, and walked away. Chapter 3. The investigation begins. Athens County Sheriff's Department Detective Hal Beaumont was assigned as lead investigator on the Holloway case in September 1987, and Hal Beaumont would spend the next 23 years of his professional life and a significant portion of his personal life, including 2 failed relationships and 1 hospitalization for stress-related hypertension, trying to figure out who had killed Jane Aldridge. Hal was 42 years old when the case landed on his desk, a compact, serious man with a salt-and-pepper mustache and a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, the kind of detective who slept with a legal pad on his nightstand and kept index cards in his shirt pocket. He was the right man for this case, as it turned out, in the sense that the case required someone who would never fully let it go, but also, for the first decade of the investigation, very much the wrong man for the case, because Hal Beaumont became convinced, early and firmly and almost unshakably, that Dennis Ray Aldridge had killed Jane Aldridge. And there were reasons for that conviction that were not unreasonable. Dennis was the husband, and statistically, when a married woman is murdered, the husband is almost always the starting point. Dennis had a documented history of arguments with Jane. Multiple witnesses had heard raised voices from the Elmwood Road house in the months before Jane's death. Jane had told Patrice Wheeler she was thinking about leaving Dennis. Dennis had no alibi for the actual time of death. Being at a bar from around 8 to midnight is a solid-ish alibi, but if Jane was killed between 10:30 and midnight or even after midnight, the timeline got complicated. Dennis had scratches on his left forearm when investigators first interviewed him, which he explained by saying he'd been clearing brush along the back fence of the property 2 days before Jane went missing, a claim that was partially corroborated by a neighbor who said she had seen him doing yard work but couldn't pinpoint the exact day. And Dennis, in those early interviews, had an affect that unsettled Hal, composed in a way that didn't quite match the situation, precise in a way that felt rehearsed, cooperative on the surface while being subtly deflective in the specifics, the way some people are when they're lying and they're good at it but not quite good enough. For years, Hal worked the case with Dennis at the center. He interviewed Dennis dozens of times over the course of the investigation. He looked at Dennis's finances, his phone records, his relationships with other women. There had been at least one affair, confirmed in 1986, with a woman who worked at a diner in Chauncey, a revelation that did nothing to help Dennis's position as the primary person of interest. He tried to find the friend Jane was going to meet the night she died. That friend was never conclusively identified. He canvassed the area around the logging road and the forest repeatedly, looking for witnesses who might have seen Jane's car or Jane herself on that stretch of County Road 25. He worked with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation on forensic analysis of evidence collected from the scene, including soil samples, fiber samples from Jane's clothing, and trace evidence from the car. He followed up tips, dozens of them over the years, hundreds if you count the ones that came in after a 1998 episode of a true crime television program that featured Jane's case. He drove that logging road in every season for 20 years, in rain and in snow and in the flat gray light of Ohio November, turning over what he knew and what he didn't know and what he suspected but could never prove. And always, always, the case came back to Dennis. But there was a problem. There was never any physical evidence linking Dennis Aldridge to the crime scene, to Jane's car, or to Jane's body. The scratches on his arm proved nothing. His alibi, while imperfect, couldn't be definitively broken. And for all Dennis's unsettling composure in interviews, composure alone doesn't put someone in handcuffs. Hal knew it. The prosecutors knew it. Without something more, they had nothing actionable, and charging Dennis on suspicion and a bad feeling was not justice. It was a shortcut that could blow up in the worst possible way and let a killer walk free forever on double jeopardy grounds. So the case sat, and sat, and sat. Jane's daughter Emily grew up in Millfield with her father Dennis, her aunt Carol visiting frequently, her grandparents Bobby and Dorothy making the drive from Nelsonville as often as their aging bodies and their grief allowed. Dorothy Holloway, Jane's mother, never recovered. She told investigators in a 1995 interview, "I wake up in every morning and think about her. I go to sleep at night with her picture on my nightstand. I hope to see her in my dreams. Sometimes I do. But when I wake up, she's still gone, and the pain is just as bad."
Follow-up interview that she set a place at the table for Jane on every holiday for the first 5 years after her death, not because she was in denial, but because she wanted to make sure the space stayed visible, stayed acknowledged, stayed real, because the alternative, folding Jane's absence into the ordinary structure of dinners and Christmases and summer birthdays, felt like participating in something she refused to participate in. Dorothy Holloway died of congestive heart failure in 2003. Bobby Holloway, Jane's father, lived until 2011, long enough to see the case break open, long enough to know what had really happened to his daughter. And he said in an interview after the arrest that his greatest regret was that Dorothy had not lived to know the truth, that Dorothy had spent her last years on this earth not knowing, and that that was the cruelest part of all of it, crueler even than what had been done to Jane. Emily Rose Aldridge grew up to be, by all accounts, a thoughtful and resilient young woman who became a social worker in Columbus, who married a man named Patrick Chen in 2009, who had 2 children of her own by 2013. She knew her mother only through photographs and stories and the particular grief that attaches itself to children who lose a parent before memory forms, a grief that is abstract and concrete at the same time, a grief for something you can't quite remember but that shapes the entire architecture of your life regardless. Emily cooperated with investigators at various points over the years. She visited the logging road once in 2004 when she was 17 years old, on the anniversary of her mother's death, and stood between the 2 fallen oak trees that had long since rotted into the ground. And she stood there for a long time, saying nothing. She never went back. Dennis Aldridge, throughout all of these years, maintained his innocence. He remarried in 1993 a woman named Susan Faber, who was fully aware of the shadow the case cast over Dennis's life, and who, for reasons that are hers alone to explain, chose to marry him anyway. He stayed in Millfield until 1999, when he relocated to Chillicothe for work. He was periodically re-interviewed by investigators, including Hal Beaumont, who retired from the Athens County Sheriff's Department in 2007 after 31 years of service, but who remained, in his own retirement, in contact with the department about the Holloway case, because Hal Beaumont was constitutionally incapable of closing a drawer on a case he hadn't solved. After his retirement, Hal kept his own copy of the case files in a storage unit in Athens, organized in 37 manila folders in 3 cardboard boxes, cross-referenced with a handwritten index on a yellow legal pad. He drove past the logging road on County Road 25 on the 14th of September every year until 2010. He just drove past it. He didn't stop. It was something he needed to do. Chapter 5. The Break. On March 3, 2010, Jane Holloway's 49th birthday, a fact that would strike everyone involved as eerie and significant, and maybe meaningful in that way that the universe sometimes seems to arrange its punctuation. A phone call came into the Athens County Sheriff's Department from a payphone at a gas station outside of Pikeville, Kentucky. The call was taken by a dispatcher named Renee Akins, who later said the man on the other end of the line sounded like someone who had been carrying something extremely heavy for a very long time and had finally decided to put it down regardless of the consequences. The man did not immediately give his name. He said he had information about a murder in Ohio. He said the murder had happened in Athens County in 1987. He said the victim was a woman named Jane Holloway. Renee Akins, trained and professional, kept him on the line, transferred the call to the on-duty detective, and within minutes the information was being recorded. The caller's name, which he eventually provided, was Raymond Earl Dockery. And Raymond Earl Dockery was 58 years old, a construction worker from Kentucky who had spent time in Ohio in the 1980s, working various jobs, including a stretch in Athens County in 1986 and 1987. Raymond said he had not killed Jane Holloway. He said he knew who had. He said the person who had killed Jane Holloway was not Dennis Aldridge. And he said the reason he had never come forward before was because the person who had killed Jane Holloway had told him directly in 1988 that if Raymond ever said a word to anyone, Raymond's family, Raymond had 2 daughters in 1988, ages 4 and 6, would be made to pay for it in a way that Raymond would not be able to undo. Raymond said he had believed that threat. He said he had lived with it for 22 years. He said the person who had made that threat was now dead, had died 6 weeks earlier in a hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, of liver cancer, had died slowly and badly over the course of 8 months, and that his death was what had finally freed Raymond to make this call. Raymond said the man who had killed Jane Holloway Aldridge was a man named Curtis Wayne Feller. Chapter 6. Curtis Wayne Feller. Curtis Wayne Feller was born in 1951 in Logan, Ohio. He had a criminal record that stretched back to 1969, assault charges in his early 20s, a conviction for armed robbery in 1974 that sent him to Chillicothe Correctional Institution for 4 years, charges of domestic violence in 1981 and 1984 that were ultimately dropped when the victim in each case declined to cooperate with prosecutors. A pattern that investigators examining his history in 2010 recognized immediately and grimly as the signature of a man who knew exactly how to control and intimidate the people around him. In 1986 and 1987, Curtis Feller had been working construction in Athens County, which is how he had met Raymond Earl Dockery. They worked on the same crew for about 8 months. They were not close friends. They were work acquaintances, the kind of men who eat lunch on a job site and trade complaints about the foreman, and knew each other's general circumstances without knowing each other's souls. Feller had moved to Kentucky sometime in 1988, and by all external appearances had spent the subsequent decades living a quiet and unremarkable life, working, marrying twice, attending a Baptist church in Lexington that described him after his death as a devoted member and a generous contributor to the food bank. He died in January 2010 at liver cancer at age 58, which means that if the law had moved even slightly faster, if Raymond Dockery had found his courage even 6 months earlier, Curtis Feller might have faced justice before the cancer took him. As it happened, the only justice available was the truth, and whether that is sufficient is a question I will leave with you. Chapter 7. What Raymond Dockery Said. Over the course of multiple interviews with Athens County investigators, interviews that took place in Pikeville, Kentucky, with Kentucky law enforcement present, and that were later supplemented by a formal recorded statement given in Athens in April 2010, Raymond Earl Dockery told investigators everything he knew. He told it slowly and with evident pain, and investigators who were present at those interviews described him consistently as a man telling the truth with the specific quality of truth that comes from 22 years of pressure finally releasing. Not smooth, not polished, not organized for effect, but raw and exhausted and detailed in the way that actual memory is detailed, with texture and specific images and the kind of peripheral information that fabricated stories generally don't include. Raymond said that in September 1987, he had been at a job site in Athens County when Curtis Feller had told him, casually, the way you might mention a minor inconvenience, that he had done something to a woman and needed help moving a car. Raymond said he had not known at that point what Feller meant by done something. He said Feller had told him it was a matter of doing something. He said that Feller had told him it was about doing something in the past. Raymond said that Feller had told him he had done something to a woman. Raymond said he had understood what that meant. He said that Feller had told him he needed help moving a car. He said that Feller had told him the car was on a logging road, on County Road 25, and that Feller had needed that help because he had been in the car alone with a woman, and he had done something to the woman in the car, and that the woman was now in the car.
Was a situation that had gotten out of hand and that he needed Raymond to help him drive a car out to a logging road and leave it there so it looked like the woman had driven herself there. Raymond said he had agreed, partly because Feller was intimidating in person, large, calm in a way that was more menacing than explosive, the kind of calm that communicated capability rather than restraint, and partly because Raymond, at that time, had been drinking heavily and was not making decisions that he was proud of. Raymond said he had not seen Jane Holloway's body. He said he had driven a second vehicle out to the logging road off County Road 25, had followed Feller, who was driving the tan Toyota Corolla, had waited while Feller got out and left the car with Jane's purse inside, and then had driven Feller back toward town. He said Feller had said almost nothing during the drive back. He said that 2 days later, after Jane's body had been discovered and it was on the news, Feller had found Raymond and told him that Raymond had better understand that what he had helped with made him equally responsible, and that if Raymond talked, Feller would make sure Raymond was charged, and that beyond the legal consequences, Raymond's daughters would learn what their father had done, and beyond even that, Feller had looked at Raymond with a specific kind of steadiness in his eyes and said simply that Raymond should think carefully about his family's safety, and Raymond had understood the implication completely and had believed it completely and had said nothing for 22 years. Chapter 8. Corroboration. The information Raymond Dockery provided sent investigators back into the evidence that had been collected in 1987 and the years since, looking now with a different question and therefore finding different answers. Investigators pulled the original trace evidence from Jane's car, the fiber samples, the soil analysis, and sent them to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation for re-examination with updated forensic technology that hadn't existed in 1987. They went back to witnesses who had been interviewed in the original investigation, looking specifically for anyone who had known Curtis Feller, anyone who had seen him during the week of September 14th through 17th, 1987. Anyone who had noticed anything about his behavior, or his car, or his associations during that period. They found 3 former co-workers from the construction crew who confirmed that Curtis Feller had called in sick on September 15th and 16th, 1987, the days immediately following Jane's murder, which had not previously been noted as significant because nobody had been looking at Feller. They found a woman named Barbara Estes who had briefly dated Feller in 1987, who said in a 2010 interview that Feller had ended their relationship abruptly in September 1987 and had seemed in the weeks afterward to be, she paused looking for the word, contained, like he was keeping everything inside on purpose, like he was working real hard at being normal, which she had attributed at the time to the breakup, but which she had sometimes, over the years, thought about in the context of what she'd read in the paper about Jane Holloway's murder, though she'd never made the connection explicit to herself, because Curtis had seemed, when she looked back, like a man who was capable of most things, but not that. The updated forensic analysis of trace evidence from the car found fiber consistent with a type of work canvas common to construction site jackets, a fiber type that had been collected in 1987, but that had not at the time been matched to anything or anyone, because there was no one to match it to other than Dennis, whose jackets had been tested and had not produced a match. The evidence could not prove Curtis Feller had been in the car. He was dead, there was no sample to compare, but it was consistent with Raymond's account and inconsistent with Dennis Aldridge's vehicle and wardrobe as tested in 1987. And then there was the soil. The soil found on Jane's clothing in 1987 had been analyzed at the time and found to contain a specific mineral composition that was characteristic of a particular geological formation in Athens County, but the precise origin of that soil had never been pinpointed. In 2010, a geologist from Ohio University, working in consultation with investigators, analyzed the soil composition against a detailed geological survey of the area and identified its most probable source as a specific location approximately 2 miles from the logging road on County Road 25. A location that, when investigators drove out to examine it, turned out to be the former site of a construction staging area that had been used by the company that employed both Curtis Feller and Raymond Dockery in 1987. Chapter 9. What motive? The question that naturally and immediately arises, and the question that Raymond Dockery could only partially answer, is why? Why Jane Holloway Aldridge? What connection, if any, did Curtis Wayne Feller have to this woman who lived on Elmwood Road and was studying at Ohio University and thinking about leaving her husband? Raymond said in his interviews that Feller had spoken to him only once about why, and that what Feller had said was vague and clipped, in the way of a man who did not feel obligated to explain himself. Feller had said that the woman had gotten into something that wasn't her business. Raymond had not known what that meant. Investigators, working through Jane's life in the summer and fall of 1987, with Curtis Feller as a new reference point, discovered something they had not found before, something that had been there in the original files, overlooked because there had been no reason to look at it. Jane Holloway Aldridge had been taking an evening course at Ohio University in the fall of 1987, a business course, and the professor of that course, a man named Leonard Krauss, had reported to the university administration in September 1987, before Jane's death, a complaint made by Jane about a fellow student who had been harassing her, making unwanted advances, and who had followed her to her car twice in the university parking garage. That complaint had been filed with the university, had generated a letter to the student in question, and then had disappeared into administrative inaction, in the way that complaints by women in 1987 very often did. Investigators in 2010 pulled that file. The student Jane had complained about was listed in the university records as employed part-time in the fall of 1987 by the same construction company that employed Curtis Feller. He was not Curtis Feller. He was a younger man whose name cannot be shared due to ongoing privacy considerations, but he and Feller had worked together on the same sites. Whether Feller was acting on behalf of someone else, whether there was a connection between the harassment complaint and Jane's murder, or whether the connection was less direct than that, whether Jane had seen something, knew something, had inadvertently placed herself in proximity to something involving Feller through this chain of acquaintance, investigators were never able to definitively establish. What they established was proximity. Feller knew Jane Holloway. He had reason to want her silenced. He had the capacity and the willingness to do what was done. The full why may have died with Curtis Wayne Feller in a Lexington hospital in January 2010. Chapter 10. Dennis Aldridge. When investigators contacted Dennis Aldridge in March 2010 to inform him that the investigation had taken a significant new direction and that he was no longer being considered a person of interest in his wife's murder, Dennis Ray Aldridge, by then 58 years old, living in Chillicothe, married to Susan Faber for 17 years, sat on the phone for a long moment and said nothing. The detective who made that call, a younger investigator,
named Marcos Reyes, who had been brought onto the cold case team in 2008, described the silence as one of the most complicated silences he had ever heard, which is an odd thing to say about a silence, and which Marcos acknowledged, but which everyone who heard him describe the call understood immediately. Dennis had known for 23 years that many of the people in his life believed he had killed his wife. He had known that the detective named Hal Beaumont believed it with a conviction that had not meaningfully wavered in 2 decades. He had known that Jane's family, Bobby and Dorothy and Carol Holloway, had likely believed it. He had known that some of his neighbors had believed it, that some of his co-workers had believed it, that the looks and the whispers and the careful social distance that he had experienced in Millfield for 12 years before finally leaving had been generated by that belief. He had lived inside that belief for 23 years, and now someone was calling to say they'd been wrong, and Dennis was 58 years old, and Jane was still dead, and their daughter Emily was a grown woman with children of her own, and nothing that was going to be said in this phone call was going to give back a single day of the 23 years that had been spent under that cloud. When Dennis finally spoke, according to Marcos Reyes, he said, "I want to know his name." He was told. He said, "I want to know if he suffered." He was told about the liver cancer, the 8 months, the hospital in Lexington. He said, "Good." And then he thanked Marcos Reyes for calling, and he hung up. He has not spoken publicly about the case since. That is his right. Hal Beaumont, who was living in retirement in Athens when Marcos called him with the news, reportedly went silent for a moment and then said quietly, "God, I owe that man an apology." He called Dennis the next day. What was said between them is not known. It is private. Some things should be. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The Athens County Prosecutor's Office reviewed the complete case file in 2010 and determined that while the evidence against Curtis Wayne Feller was compelling and would likely have supported charges had he been alive, the case against Raymond Earl Dockery for his role in moving the car, a role that made him an accessory after the fact, was complicated by the extraordinary circumstances of the coercion Dockery had described and by the fact that Dockery's cooperation had been essential to breaking the case. After consultation with the Ohio Attorney General's office, prosecutors declined to charge Dockery, citing prosecutorial discretion and the practical reality that a jury, confronted with a man who had been threatened into silence for 22 years and had come forward voluntarily the moment the threat was removed, was unlikely to return a conviction, regardless of technical legal guilt. Raymond Dockery gave a public statement in May 2010, read by his attorney outside the Athens County Courthouse, in which he addressed Jane Holloway's family directly and said that there was no adequate apology, that he knew that, and that all he could offer was the truth, which he had given as completely and as honestly as he knew how. Carol Holloway, Jane's sister, was present at the courthouse when that statement was read. She did not respond publicly. Emily Rose Aldridge Chen was in Columbus at work and learned about the statement from a text message sent by her husband. She stepped outside the office and stood in an alley behind the building and let herself feel whatever she felt, which she has described in subsequent years as something too complicated to summarize. Grief and relief and anger and something almost like closure, but not quite closure, because closure implies a door fully shut, and she was not sure that door ever fully shuts for the people left behind by violence, was not sure it should, was not sure that the shutting of a door was what she wanted. Hal Beaumont drove out to the logging road on County Road 25 on the day the case was officially closed, September 14, 2010, the 23rd anniversary of Jane's death. He parked his car and got out and walked into the forest to where the two fallen oaks had been. They had rotted completely into the ground by then. There was nothing to mark the spot. He stood there for about 10 minutes, and then he walked back to his car, and he drove home, and he did not drive out there again. Chapter 12. What this case tells us. Cases like Jane Holloway's, and there are more of them than most people realize, cold cases cracked open by a deathbed confession, or a phone call from a payphone at a gas station in Kentucky, or a piece of evidence reanalyzed with technology that didn't exist when the crime happened. Cases like Jane's ask us to sit with several uncomfortable truths simultaneously. The first is that investigative tunnel vision is real, and it is dangerous, and it is not unique to bad detectives. Hal Beaumont was, by most measures, a good detective, thorough, dedicated, dogged, genuinely motivated by justice. He was also wrong for 23 years, wrong in a way that shaped the lives of everyone around him and around the case, wrong in a way that he would have to live with for the rest of his own life. The second uncomfortable truth is that threat and coercion and fear are extraordinarily effective at suppressing the truth, and that Raymond Dockery, whatever his moral and legal culpability, was genuinely a frightened man who believed his family was in danger, and that the 22 years of his silence were as much a product of what Curtis Wayne Feller did as the murder itself was. The third truth is about the reach of violence, how far it travels from the moment of its commission, how many lives it shapes and distorts and diminishes, how it moves through time in ways that the person who commits it never fully accounts for and probably never thinks about. Dennis Aldridge lived 23 years under suspicion for something he didn't do. Emily Rose Aldridge Chen grew up without a mother and with a father whose name carried a shadow that should never have been attached to it. Carol Holloway spent 2 decades not knowing, then spent the rest of her life knowing, and neither was anything resembling okay. Bobby Holloway spent his final years finally understanding what had happened to his daughter, but without his wife beside him to share that understanding. Jane herself, Jane with her loud, contagious laugh, her yellow porch swing, her evening classes, her plans to change her life, Jane was 26 years old when she was killed, and she had more life ahead of her than she had behind her, and that arithmetic never stops being devastating, no matter how many times you do it. Outro. Jane Marie Holloway was laid to rest in Athens County in September 1987. Her grave is in a cemetery in Nelsonville, Ohio, next to her mother Dorothy, who waited 16 years to be buried beside her daughter, and who, when she was finally lowered into the ground in 2003, was positioned according to Carol's specific instructions to the funeral home, facing her daughter's stone. Curtis Wayne Feller is buried in Lexington, Kentucky, in a grave with a headstone that says, "Beloved Husband and Father." Raymond Earl Dockery lives, as of the last available information, in eastern Kentucky. Dennis Aldridge and Susan Faber still live in Chillicothe. Emily Rose Aldridge Chen is a social worker in Columbus. The white clapboard house on Elmwood Road in Millfield has been painted gray. The yellow porch swing is gone. This has been Cold Case Files. If you or someone you know has information about an unsolved crime, I urge you not to wait 22 years. The families left behind are waiting. They are always waiting. They will wait for however long it takes. Please don't make them wait. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video, because the more people know about cases like Jane's, the better the chance that someone, somewhere, hears something that leads to justice for a family that is still out there, still waiting, right now, tonight, just like Jane's family once was.